Okay, welcome everybody to our Friday 2 p.m. Eastern webinar on finding funding for the glue for the Building Better Regions community of practice. I'm Dan Berglund, President and CEO of SSTI. Couple just housekeeping notes. We are recording the first part of this webinar, but once we get through the slides, we'll turn the recording off so that we can have an open Q&A and discussion among the participants. Susan, if you want to go to the first slide, and Casey, once that slide comes up, you can go ahead and run the first poll question. Okay, we'll be right back with the slides.
Technical difficulties.
Yeah, it was not our smoothest run through the folks. There we go.
Okay. And Casey, if you can throw up, great. And there are three separate questions here for you all to answer. If you're a little visually challenged, like I am, there is a scroll bar on the right-hand side. So even though it says question one, there are actually three questions here. So if you can complete each of these questions, this is just to give everybody a sense as to who's on the call, and give us a little bit of an idea of the profile of the folks that are here. So we're curious as to how long you've been working together, whether or not you currently have funding for operational support, and if you do have that funding, how long you anticipate that is going to last. So I'm going to ask for last call here for people to submit. And
yeah, I was gonna say, give them a couple of seconds. Got 54 on.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So on the first question, most of you are relatively new to working with each other, it appears. 79% within the last 3 years of the coalition working together. 54% of you have funding for your operational support, 46% don't. For those of you that do have funding for operational support, you anticipate the vast majority of you, 78%, that will run out over the next 3 years. So I think that gives us a good base on which to understand where you all are coming from. Susan, if you're ready to move on to the next slide, we wanted to start first with a couple key definitions so that we're all working off of the same page. The first is we're going to use the term coalition a lot in this presentation. And for us, that means the entity that pulled all of the parties together to pursue the regional challenge funding. And when we're talking about glue, that is really the administrative function that is bringing all of those parties together. Susan, let's go on to the next slide. The former SBA administrator, Karen Mills, who's done a lot of work in cluster initiatives, used to say, yeah, the problem is glue is really important, but no one likes to fund the glue. And I think that is what most of us have experienced. Let's go to the next slide and cover what it is that we're going to do today. So we want to take a look at some of the first steps in finding funding, give you some examples of funding models that various organizations around the country have used, why some of those models work and why they don't, give you some ideas on sources of funding, and also have a discussion about your experience. So our overall objective is to try and help you with some next step guidance to sustain the mission and operations of your coalition. I should mention these slides will be available through the Building Better Regions Community of Practice website, so you don't have to frantically take notes. And also, if you have questions along the way, please feel free and put them in the chat, and we'll either address them during the presentation part or during the discussion part. Okay, let's move on to next slide on SSTI. So just for those of you that aren't familiar with SSTI, we're a national nonprofit organization that works to strengthen initiatives to create better future through science, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. We're a strategic partner to RTI on the Building Better Regions community of practice. And we've got about 150 members located across the country. Let's go to the next slide. So I think one of the critical steps in trying to find funding is making sure that you have a clear mindset for yourself, and that you're able to clearly articulate what your purpose is, what your vision is, and what your mission is. So if you're going to solicit funding from any kind of source, you have to be able to answer these three things. And specifically on the purpose, what exactly is the problem that you're trying to solve, or the opportunity that could be realized? Are you trying to address climate change? Are you trying to address healthcare issues? Are you trying to close the income gap? Stating it in a big picture of what it is that you are trying to accomplish. In short, how will the world be better? So a good way of thinking about this to try and sum up your organization is you want a statement that clearly defines the problem and gives the solution. So for some of the work that SSTI has done in the past, what we have done is the country as a whole has great scientific and technical resources, and there's a changing economy, but those resources aren't being used effectively to improve our world. Therefore, we need to do this. So think of it as a 2 or 3 step. You need that clarity in purpose. Let's move on to the next slide. So this is a survey question for folks. Thank you, Casey. Given where your coalition is right now, how comfortable are you in what your mission, vision, and purpose are? And we know for both the phase 1 and phase 2 recipients that things are changing, either because new opportunities are arising or because of funding situation. So give it just one more minute for folks to last call for people to answer. All right, I'm going to end this as people sneak in one last one and share the results with you. So you see 46% are very comfortable. That's great. Mark and I had a little side bet going into this. Mark won the side bet. That 54% of you aren't very comfortable is an indication that there's some work to do in defining exactly what your mission, vision, and purpose are. And let me stop sharing that. And Susan, if you're able to advance the slide, that's great. Okay. Next question is about your primary source of operational funding. So Casey's got the poll up for us here, 5 options. This is which one is your most significant source of funding at this point. And by earned income, we mean things like if you're running an incubator, the rent that you have off of that. Private companies and individuals, we're separating out from foundations, and then obviously foundations is self-explanatory, and government public, that could be either the federal end of things or the state or local. So last call to respond on this poll. What we're going to do after we share the results is talk a little bit about, okay, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. So, and share the results. So you can see of the folks on the call, 70%, your primary source of funding is government funding, with the rest being very evenly split between these other sources of funding. So I think it makes sense that a lot of you are on this session because you're obviously looking to diversify your funding beyond the government funding, which is great. That's exactly what you want to do in order to sustain your operations over the long term. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Susan. And we'll take a look at who exactly is funding this. And we've given you some indication based on those broad categories of who is funding the activity. The polling function is super helpful, but it is also super glitchy when it comes to sharing the screen. Susan, it's going to be a couple down.
Yeah, number 10.
That. Yeah, there we go. All right. There. Oh, nope. There. Okay. Mark, you want to take this over?
Sure, happy to. And one thing should add on the technical side of things, feel free at any point to throw questions in the chat rather than the Q&A function. We'll be reading that. If there's things that we can respond to you directly during the session, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll hit all of the questions at the end. All right, so this is essentially a brain dump from us. You know, SSTI has been around for 26 years, and Dan and I both have been in the field for approaching 40. And so these are all of the different examples of folks who have supported the types of projects within the coalitions. So this is beyond operating support. At the same time, operating support could come from almost any of these. And it makes sense if you're new organizations, as you mentioned, 1 year in, that your first funding may be primarily from a public sector, because the public sector is the one who wants to see this happen. However, as we'll show you shortly, the blue column there, the earned income, is one of the things we encourage you to be striving toward over time. And that's a long list. We won't go through all of them, but this is just to tee it up for our discussion later. Susan, next one. So we're going to start walking through, as it's teeing up, the first, or we're going to continue with the first steps with the next group. So that Dan talked about the idea of unifying around a central mission or vision, and that is the role of the coalition, the RICO, and that glue piece. But to diversify your funding streams, I encourage you to think about deconstructing then what your activities are. And I won't read each of these questions because we've got 3 slides with a lot of text on them. But just trying to think about all of the pieces of and parts of what you're trying to accomplish, what that mission is. Some of them are going to be within your organization or your coalition, some of them won't. But what has to happen? What are the most critical pieces? And how can some of your operating support or glue be attached to that? And then also thinking how, like it says at the bottom, how do they all, does it all hang together? And what's the messaging around that? Next slide, Susan. And then it's who cares about those pieces. And as you can see, this will end up being a rather involved process. You're not likely to do all of this overnight. It should certainly be done as a group, including the clients or customers or shareholders that should be a part of the outcomes or impacts. And you know, all of us, or most of us, working with entrepreneurs and startups and other businesses, we talk about value proposition and the need for them to be constantly thinking about what does the customer care about. Design thinking, that empathy is the first aspect to it. That I personally feel is one of the things that's missing from a lot of the proposals I review or the messaging that we put out there. It's like, well, of course we need to do this and it's all about us. But we need to put ourselves into the why should somebody else care and connecting to their motivations. Next one, Susan. Oh, and those, I should say, and you don't have to go back. The gives people a chance to read these. But that is their alignment to what you're offering. The next session we're going to do in this series around funding and fundraising will be a 101 on foundations, and work that we did a few years ago now, just interviewing foundations that were supporting economic development. There were 5 different motivations as to why they cared about this, and it varied significantly by the type of foundation that it was. So on that last slide listed a few of them, but we'll go into that detail on April 18th. And then, yeah, so then beyond the grant, and grants are nice. We all want money that has some strings, in some agencies more strings than others, but we also need to be thinking about how can some of our other activities, what are some of the other financial tools that make sense over the long term? And that's where that list of over 50 different funding streams come in. What could be structured as a loan or a contract or a fee for service? Or a foundation may be willing to support you, but they also may want you to have some skin in the game in the sense of a long-term patient payback through either a mission-related investment or a program-related investment. And then and this is where SSTI, or at least some of us at SSTI have been called perhaps a little too realistic, in that you got to be realistic about the time, and do you have the talent to write the right proposals or to put together the resources that you need? What are the odds? Is it actually worth competing for it? We recently had one through USDA that they essentially told us, hey, don't advertise this because we don't have very much money. And why have people waste their time writing proposals when we're going to make 1 or 2 awards? They didn't say that exactly, but you know what I mean. Also, the trust within the organizations is critical, the depth and breadth of your network, and again, making sure you're including participation beyond who's getting money and the right ways to do that. And then also recognizing life changes, priorities, and the news keep us thinking about different things all the time, so keep your structure as flexible as possible. And then also that by pursuing multiple paths, certain things will emerge in your process that you'd never imagined, but you may end up with a much more sustainable and resilient organization because of this multi-path approach outlined in these steps. All right, the next slide we identified 14 different business models, funding models that are just samples that are out there. You know, there are many different ways of cutting this. Yours won't necessarily look like any of these. I'm not recommending any of these specifically. The numbers there show that, you know, we've got one example of an organization that is essentially one funding stream, right? That's risky. Now, in their case, it's all earned income. Blue on this means they're making money. Everything they're doing is related to a service or fee that they're providing, or a structure they're providing for folks. Then there are a couple examples of those that have 2 funding streams. Gray is foundation support. Yellow is government. And so a lot of you may look like number 2, or the bottom of their number 2 right now. Several examples of folks that have diversified to 3 levels, and then also folks that have 4. We're not saying you necessarily need to have 4 different funding streams. However, there may be reasons to pursue that, and you'll see that they cut that differently each time. So we'll dive into a couple of these. The next slide.
And I just want to provide a little bit of background that Mark hasn't shared. These pie charts represent the business models of actual organizations that are involved with SSTI in some aspect. So go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, this is real. This isn't hypothetical at all.
Right.
This is based on what they've been willing to share with us about their funding sources. We did anonymize it so that it's easier for you to to get a sense for your own potential application. So these are the ones in the squares are the ones I'm going to try to run through very quickly. Next one, Susan. So here's one with 2. This is an organization that's been around. Oh, and I will say all of these organizations have been around at least 10 years. Some of them 20 and or more. And so the point being, nobody expects you to look like any of these necessarily so far. And it may make sense that your structure 15 years in looks like this, or it could be that you should be working on diversifying your strategy. But here's a statewide organization that's not getting any money from their state other than their foundation. So they're in an environment where the state won't play. So how do they work on their messaging and that value proposition to try to support, to broaden their support? Next one, Susan. Oh, and I will apologize to folks if the graphics look a little goofy sometimes, because that was one of the things we discovered when we tested this an hour ago, that things changed from what they look like on our screen. So one of the common things that we put it, well, I shouldn't say common. A lot of the e-shipbuilding, community-based, peer-based entrepreneurship support organizations, some of them arising from the startup communities work and some of the Kaufman work. A lot of those struggle with operating support after an initial buy-in. And this is an organization that's been around for 10 years that I wanted to call your attention to because, and I apologize for those question marks there, this organization, actually 70% of their income comes from rent that they earn from a building that a number of founders, private successful entrepreneurs said, we need an activity within our community to support entrepreneurship. They bought a building and all of the proceeds from the rent go to support this organization. So think about that as a possible, are there sugar daddies, or is there a large corporation that's willing to give you a building that's now, now with everybody downsizing, there's a lot of space available. Could somebody be willing to let you essentially give you the returns on that building? And they, of course, could get the tax advantages of that if you're a nonprofit. Then they also have a regionally based foundation that's supporting them, not a community foundation, but another foundation that's dedicated to growing prosperity within their region. Next one, Susan. And because of that real estate play, I wanted to show you one example of a real estate dominant organization. 89% of their money comes from real estate activities as earned income. But it breaks out this way. They're actually getting into the sales business as well as just the buildings that they own or received in donation as companies downsize. But then they've also been able to do lease or equity through lease deals with their companies, some of their startup companies, and to help with the company's work capital issues. And they're getting return from that as well. And there are a number of incubators and real estate related projects within the BBBRC. So I wanted to make sure you saw that example. Susan? The next one is an actual cluster organization, like a lot of you will be or are or should be thinking of yourself as, because you're dealing with a specific sector within a specific region that you have strong assets in already. And earned income should become relatively quickly a significant portion of your revenue stream. And revenue from that should support your operating capital, in my opinion. And Dan can disagree later, or we can throw that into the questions as well. What type of income?
Well, I was going to jump in here on this one to say, I think this is a good illustration of what Mark was saying before about, to a certain extent, what we're showing you are more end result of where you may be 10 to 15 years down the road. So when this particular organization started, most of their initial funding came from the salmon category, the sponsorship, operating grants from private corporations. And they were able to take that glue money to then expand into different areas of activities, which has led them to a more stable financial base of this large percentage of earned income. Sorry, Mark.
No, that's good. I'll counter with one point of, I believe if you get the industry buy-in early, and the reason that you're trying to stand up the organization and your next, if you're going for tech hubs or engines or all of that, getting some of that corporate buy-in early can help fill that income stream or start that process. And it shows the value to the industry. So there's question marks on this one for the earned income, because this organization has been very successful at diversifying even their earned income over the last 15 years. So next slide, Susan. Yeah, that one. Or no, you do. Yeah, that. So they have a building that they lease, that they provide incubation and co-work space. They have companies that support them through membership. They have registration for their events. They actually provide contract services to companies around innovation support, consulting, and research. And then they also do a lot of programming. And so their operating support, a lot of that becomes unrestricted revenue, right? You do have expenses related to some of those, but that contract revenue, there is a fee on those contracts. Beyond it, the rent can be, or should be, a profit stream, and membership almost always has a profit element. This is the next one. Trying to get, still got 3 more of these folks, sorry. This is another cluster hub that's been around for a very long time. You see that they've managed to diversify their streams quite significantly. One thing that maybe you've noticed as we've gone along, and I wanted to call more attention to it when I had the 11 up, but there is very little foundation support in any of these organizations. We all think, oh, foundations could be a good resource. They are a tough nut to crack, and the fit is often very limited. So this group has some, and again, it's regionally based, but not a whole lot. But this is probably the most evenly distributed across the 4 of all of the groups. But again, it took them 20 years to do that.
Right. And I was going to say, one of the keys on this is if you had looked at this chart 20 years ago, it would have been probably 50-50 between the foundation funding and the corporate money for the organization.
Definitely true. Next one, Susan. Here's another one that's managed to cobble together 4 different funding streams. This is a venture development organization with multiple funds that they manage. All of their corporate money, or all of their foundation support, is from corporate foundations, and they're expecting a return. So a program-related investment, they're actually expecting a larger return. Mission-related means they're more patient, and there's room for that money to be forgiven more easily. So, all right, and oh yeah, and our public side, 95% of their public dollars are from the state. I just wanted to call attention to trying to diversify even your public sources beyond federal dollars. Last one, Susan.
Yeah,
Oh, go
actually,
ahead, yeah.
sorry, Susan, perfect, thank you. So actually, this is interesting too, because I think this is an organization that is more in the middle of its growth. So I think based on what we would expect to see trend line from the 10+ years to 20 years is you would see the blue and the salmon expand, and the yellow decrease in size over time. So, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
No, last one. All right, and I wanted to show, although I don't think we have many of the for-profit partners that provide entrepreneurial services on the call, I wanted to show you at least one example. And this is a group and an organization that many of you may work with, but I wanted to show you what their, most of their stuff comes in the form of government grants or contracts. They also have foundations that are supporting their work for their regions. So again, a regionally based foundation focus. I think they have at least one community foundation as a partner too. But their operating capital, for the most part, is coming from the profits on their contracts, the sponsorship dollars that they're able to recruit from local folks, and then profits from their operating grants because they are a for-profit company. All right, so the next slide is actually a very high-level presentation of some of the different funding sources. And Dan was like, no, you got to give them a better list than this. And the problem is, and we can talk about this as a group going into the discussion part about who you've worked with and what your experiences may have been and who turned out to be an organization or agency that you recommend others avoid as well. I started to come up with a list of the different foundations so that I could point to them for you guys, or not foundation, federal sources. I've got 12 from rural development at USDA alone. So what we'll need to do is figure out the best way to educate you on each of those kind of opportunities that make the most sense after you've done that market segmentation and identifying what pieces. I will say at our conference in the fall, we are planning to dedicate at least an entire afternoon around how do you actually tap into all of the different federal funding sources. So there's one plug for keeping you involved in the organization.
So a couple things that I want to mention specifically. The Building Better Regions community of practice has been emailing out various funding opportunities that we see that we think might be of interest to you all. Those typically come as emails from Pearl Sullivan at RTI, so keep your eyes out for that. One specific bullet point here that I want to call out is the very last one, is the State Local Recovery Fund. We have it here as federal funding source because it originated through congressional action, but this is actually at the state level. This is, you'll hear it maybe referred to a number of different ways, but it is funding from the feds during the pandemic to help ensure that state and local governments did not take a large budget hit. There is large flexibility in the way that states are able to use that funding. And a good portion of that funding in some states still has not been allocated. So there is the potential to make the pitch to your governor's office, to your economic development agency, to your local legislators, that supporting your kind of activity could be something that they support out of the state local recovery fund. Just a couple quick examples here. State of Connecticut spent $1 million at Connecticut Center for Applied Technologies. Indiana allocated a couple $100 million to their regional economic acceleration and development initiatives. North Dakota allocated $20 million for hydrogen development grants, and Wisconsin $75 million for equitable recovery grants. So there are precedents on states using that funding for economic development purposes. Susan, let's go on to the next slide, where we try to capture some of the lessons from these various models and sources. As with almost everything, every situation and funding model is unique. The examples that we've given you, that's to both demonstrate how different a business model can be, but also the evolution over time of the funding for GLUE to support your administrative operations. I will say that in our experience looking at cluster initiatives, the work that we've done with them over the last decade, cluster initiatives have generally run into problems when they start their operations by giving people something for free. And then as the government or foundation support for those cluster initiatives goes away, then trying to transition to asking people to pay for them. So you're better off at least starting with some kind of fee-based structure so that people get used to paying, and also it's a test as to how much they value the work that you are providing to them. The membership private sector support, I don't think Mark and I can stress this enough. That is absolutely critical, both on its flexibility, but also as a platform that you're able to use to demonstrate support to other funders, so that you can show government partners, you can show foundations that you have a constituency that is interested in this and is willing to put in some funding, but you need that additional funding in order to expand your operations.
If I can
Yep.
reemphasize that, if a state legislator is ideologically open to supporting economic development, your best champion is going to be the companies that employ people in their district or in the state, saying that what you're doing is important versus any story you can tell. So getting their buy-in early and becoming champions or involved is critical.
As I think most of the people on this call know, federal funding is generally very project specific or one-time funding. So it's great to have. It is difficult for that to be the only source of funding for a sustainable future. State and local funding can be ongoing, but you need to build champions in order to get that funding, and you need to ensure that those that you're ever expanding that base of champions, because legislators, governors, economic development agency officials leave. I think Mark alluded to this before. I think for some folks, there's a feeling that foundation funding is sort of the holy grail of this. And it can be fantastic, but for lots of regions of the US, it's just unavailable, or it's very difficult and time consuming to get. Mark will go into that more on an April 18th session. And then I think a general set of cautions is there is the temptation, and in particular with all of the federal money that has been available in the last couple of years, to chase after the money, to jump from funding opportunity to funding opportunity. And not only, as you all can attest, even better than we can, not only is that physically and emotionally exhausting, but it also has the strong possibility of changing your focus from what your original mission and purpose was to just going after the money. And okay, next slide. Just some specific next steps for you. This will be something for you all to reference when you've got the slides. In this, Mark covered some of this in the market segmentation as well. I think the second question is not something that we've really touched on that you all might want to consider is funders are going to be looking for how does this coalition work together? And in particular, since so many of you are new, they're going to be trying to understand, is this an organization that's likely to continue? If we invest funding in this set of operations, is it going to have an impact? So being able to define that clear governance structure is going to be important. And then finally, the final slide is just our contact information. Again, all of these slides are going to be on the Building Better Regions Community of Practice website. I'm going to, Mark, unless you've got something else that you want to make sure is on the recording, I'm going to stop the recording at this point and